education sector. I don't teach at TAFE, but I have taught at a number of schools that work on the VET system. You mentioned, Pat, the casualisation of that workforce. It's one of the most casualised industries in existence, right? And you were saying that this undermined teachers' qualifications. And in fact, what I noticed was there was a qualification of the month coming out and a big industry emerging for us as well. So I had a university degree, I was then much later an Apple certified trainer, and then suddenly the Cert 4 in training and assessment came out. $3,500 for that one. And the other thing that was happening was the squeeze was on in terms of the number of hours that we were getting employed each week. So that, and you still had to do the same job, but you know, had to do it in less and less time, and there was more and more, what do they call it, labour for work. There was more preparation, time unpaid. Supposed to be in the hourly rate, but there was no idea of how long people were going to work. So what happened that I saw was there was a bit of a brain drain, that people couldn't bear to be continually working where their work was precarious like that, where it was starting to become insufficient, and where there were more and more costs, not only for self-training, but also for hardware, software, all of those kinds of things. Staff started to have to pay for it. And so anybody who could work in the industry, in production, in my sector, went that way into the private sector themselves. And I think that what was left was mediocrity. And maybe that's why there isn't that quality of education. I just wanted to tell you that story because everyone focuses on the students and also on those who are making the profits. But there's also that story on the back end where all of this is being supported by very precarious labour, and it's quite difficult to actually make it work.
Rob Long, I'm a TAFE teacher and I'm working for the New South Wales Teachers Federation at the moment. And I just would be interested to know about Pat and Damien's awareness that the local college at Petersham is currently planning to move their electrical trades teachers and students out of Petersham. They're also cutting back on business administration, and they've already outsourced a lot of the other courses out of that course. And particularly, Pat, in relation to nationally, what we see this as a whiteouting where they'll just say, well, there's no demand for those colleges anymore, which then makes them ripe for asset sales. Is that happening in other states and in rural and regional areas? I'll give you an example. So Dapto TAFE College right now has no students, and it's basically based on this, exactly what's been explained to you tonight, about this huge increase in fees for students and therefore a drop in demand, which then they say, because there's no demand, what are we going to do with these facilities? So that whiteouting, is that then going to lead us in the next phase of this where, and we know Mike Baird really is quite keen on selling anything he can possibly sell, will that lead to further asset sales?
I think that what's happening in New South Wales TAFE, in the New South Wales TAFE system, will be a real, it will really be worth, it is worth looking at very closely, and it will be in the future, because in New South Wales the trajectory has been slower and a bit different than in other states, but the things I just and the things you've just pointed to around, for example, the creation of uncertainty, the undermining of particular courses, strategies to be able to point to demand that doesn't exist, generally undermining the system. When you combine that with the absolute debacle around the enrolment system, and the growing uncertainty in the community, and a large part of what Damien's work and Serena's work and our stuff is showing is that the biggest problem, well, where do you start? But one of the big problems in terms of the effect of what's going on is the undermining of trust in the system. Education systems and education qualifications are based on trust. people go, they enrol in qualifications and they go and they enrol in courses because they trust those institutions to provide them with quality. They don't go on My Skills website and they don't go behind the scenes. They trust institutions. And the activities of the private providers over the last 3 or 4 years, and in particular the last 12 months, where more and more providers are being exposed by the media, quite rightly, and more students are standing up and saying that they've been ripped off. It really is a question that that does not just damage the private sector. It damages the whole vet system, and it undermines trust in qualifications. So all of the strategies which cause uncertainty, where they shift delivery around, that you can't enrol, people don't know what's going on, all in the end I think are strategies to undermine the public provider. And I think the two really big lessons nationally for New South Wales, there are two really big lessons for me that they should take from other states. Victoria's the obvious one in terms of what's happening. But in South Australia, I just say to you again, and whatever this government says, in South Australia, that market was open from 20% to 80% in terms of exposure to private providers in about 6 months.
Wow.
Now that can, so when this government says to you only 15% of our funding or 20% of our funding is open to the private sector, that can change in a matter of months, and South Australia has shown us that. And the second thing is that in terms of the sorts of issues you've just talked about around the undermining of TAFE, in Queensland, which removed TAFE premises from TAFEs themselves, and where they embarked on a strategy of deliberately undermining TAFE. TAFE provision there this year, from 2013 to 2014, has dropped from about 55 right down to about 25%, and that happened in 12 months. So that's why the real issue for you in New South Wales, I reckon, is just all of the work that they've done to undermine TAFE, to cut funding, to cause uncertainty, and the problem is that the damage is being done, but the whole system they can just open up funding really, really rapidly. So I don't know that completely answers your question, but I mean, I guess the strongest message from my perspective is that there's very little to take. I mean, New South Wales is just poised on the brink, and they have to listen. They have to be able to look at what's happened in other states and learn from that.
TAFE across Australia isn't just under threat from private providers. It's squeezed in the middle from an underfunded school sector that is, that with the that has increasing pressure to increase completion rates, increase Year 12 retention rates, and so that's eating away at the kind of entry point of what's been traditionally one of TAFE's strongest catchments, and universities on the other hand, which have had a sort of 10, 15-year head start on that kind of entrepreneurial activity of finding students and designing courses around them, and designing courses around potential students and the government subsidies that might be attached to them. And so that, I think, is... I always think that I think what will... In a way, governments are looking to reduce the amount of money that they spend overall on vet, and it's conceivable that will just continue to decline. And so the longer-term threat to vet overall is finding and assuring its place between school education and university education.
I wanted to focus a little bit on the issue of private providers and the issue of regulating private providers. Most of the stories that we hear in the media about egregious behaviour by private providers relates to vet fee help and the way in which people are inappropriately enrolled in courses, the use of inducements, which is now supposed to be illegal. But I presume that that's just the tip of the iceberg, that's the most visible, and that there's equivalent, drawing on the Victorian experience, there's an equivalent level of bad behaviour amongst private providers at the certificate, the certificate 1, 2, 3 and 4 level. My question really is this: is it possible to replicate the values of public education to a series of private providers with different regulatory structures and maybe even different funding models? And if not, why not?
My starting point would be to look at the experience in early childhood education and what's happened there in terms of instituting the early years learning framework and the quality framework they've got there. There are some important differences with how VET is regulated. First of all, they directly regulate the inputs. You know, if a childcare provider is claiming subsidies for providing 15 hours of long daycare to a child, they make sure that they provided those 15 hours. What's more, they actually directly go to the centres. They inspect them much more frequently than once every 5 years. I think it's if not every year, then every 2 years in terms of full audits. And they directly examine, both through observation and written documents, effectively the curriculum in terms of seeing that the children have a supportive environment. Guess what? They have ratios. They have staff ratios in terms of saying that if you've got a certain number of students, a certain number of children, you have to have a certain number of qualified staff, and we're going to regulate, we're going to say that you need to have a diploma. This is a great irony. Early childhood education, you need to have a certain number of diploma qualified staff. Supposedly the base qualification for quality vocational education and training is a certificate 4. I mean, it's madness. So there are lots of things that you could do, but ultimately, probably the best thing you could do to ensure quality in vocational education and training, especially if we're talking about public subsidies, would be to do as you do in schools and to a fair extent in higher education and say this sector is not open for profit operators. Do that, and then a lot of the other questions I think will fall away.
Hello, my name is Ian. I've just been recently been retrenched, so I'm definitely looking out for a reputable RTO provider, preferably a TAFE one. My specialty is recycling, and that's the area I need to look at to improve my skills so I can get back in the workforce as quickly as possible. Now, my question is directed to Pat, please. It's in 2 parts. Firstly, recently the Australian Labor Party got elected in Queensland and in Victoria with promises to stand up for the TAFE system. Now, you being the TAFE secretary for AEU would be in a position to know, did they have any hard and fast promises, or was it all airy-fairy? You mentioned before that there's an inquiry. Well, in Victoria, inquiries are good if anything comes out of them, but is there anything hard and fast in the Queensland and Victorian ALP? And the second thing is South Australia. Why is it that the Labor Party, which has been in power the whole time you mentioned, is so manic to destroy the TAFE sector, or it looks like that? Is that because of the while back the purging of the centre-left people, the sort of Dunstan people?
The Queensland and Victorian elections will go down in history, I think, as TAFE elections, and really probably the New South Wales one, where TAFE just for the first time in its history was prominent as an issue for the Labor Party in all 3 of those state elections. The answer to your question around Queensland and Victoria and their commitments is that there were no firm and hard and fast commitments made by either government beyond a fairly, a broad argument that they thought that what the previous governments had done to TAFE was terrible and they would do something. They would do something for the TAFE system. In Victoria, they allocated funding, additional funding. It was nowhere near, it was well short of the funding that had been taken out of the system during the 4 years of the coalition government. But the key problem for us is that neither in Queensland nor in Victoria did either of the new governments come to power with any real policy to change what had happened in TAFE. I think there's some possibility in Queensland. They are talking about looking at quarantining funding or putting caps on funding, but there's nothing firm there, and it's a huge disappointment to us, particularly given the fact that, as you could imagine, a lot of people campaign very hard for the Labor government, for the Labor Party in both of those states around the issue of TAFE. But that leads me to the third question that you've asked, or the second question that you've asked around South Australia, which is that we need to be under no illusion that the marketisation of TAFE and the reform process, the neoliberal reforms of the TAFE system, were Labor Party policies. The 2012 National Agreement and indeed the 2007 National Agreement, both of which required commitments to introduce market reforms and competition into the vet sector, were Labor market, they were Labor Party, policies, and they were conducted under a federal Labor government. Those policies were introduced, and that national agreement was introduced under a national Labor government. I wish it were other. I wish it were other, but that's the truth of the matter. And one of the biggest problems we face is that the project of destroying TAFE, of market reforming TAFE, is a bipartisan project. And in fact, if anything, the Labor Party has been much more effective. It's been able to do things, I suspect, that the Liberals could only have dreamed about because of the way that they've approached it. The worst damage, I have to say this because it is the truth, I don't like saying it. The worst damage that was done to Victoria was done under the Labor Party. The coalition government cut funding and made it a lot worse. But the architecture of the reform process in Victoria was a Labor project. Nationally it is. And in South Australia, the Labor government there has oversighted one of the most, it is a vandalistic attack on their TAFE system, which has seen nationally the loss of more than 5,000, it would be closer to 10,000 jobs in the TAFE system across the country, and the complete destruction of the TAFE system as we know it. We are sitting nationally now on a national TAFE system where its market share is 52%. 52%. The TAFE system's share of government-funded programs nationally in 2014 is 52%. It is close to being, it is a minority provider in Queensland, Victoria and South Australia, and it is nationally sitting on 52%. Now those are the circumstances we currently face, and that's what the truth of the matter for us across the country is that if we cannot shift the Labor Party before the next federal election into embracing a policy, and we argue very strongly that it needs to be a cap on funding to the private sector, that the first and only thing that you can do to address the damage being done at this stage is to cap the amount of public funding that is going to the private sector. We say 30%. We say 30% contestable, of which the privates need to compete with TAFE for that funding. We think that's too much, but when you're looking at market contestable funding of 80% in Victoria and South Australia, we've got a long way back. And I tell you that the last thing I'll say about this is, in terms of your question, is that if ever there was a lesson that we needed to learn about this around privatisation, that when people, once you have sold it, you cannot get it back. And that's the issue that we're facing in the TAFE system. Once you look at a TAFE system where their market share is 25%, then asking governments to reinvest in this sector is going to cost them millions. And when they're faced as the alternative, just shoveling the costs onto individual students through student debt, that is the easiest and the most desirable path that we take. And that really, that is the situation for many people. Many people believe now, look, I think there is a real question about whether the public TAFE system will survive. I think there is a real question about it. I almost don't want to, you don't want to go down that path, but I think people should be under no illusion about just how precarious a position the sector is in at the moment.
My name's Graham. I was an engineer. I'd like to just ask or put a couple of points up. One is the company Vacation, which was mentioned tonight. As my reading of the business sector goes, it is now in receivership because the heads of the company, not content with making 30 cents in the dollar, rorted it even more. And the ex-chairman was Mr. Dawkins. So don't expect the Labor group to be any more understanding of the needs of the TAFE system than the dreaded rivals. Mr. I can't even think of his name, the head of South Australia's government now, they'll do anything. Weatherall. They'll do anything that the federal government asks them to do. They're trying to get a set of submarines offered to South Australia, whereas the previous Minister in the Navy for Mr. Abbott said he wouldn't trust them with a canoe. And the point is, in killing the TAFE system down there, they're taking away the group that does most of the formal training of metal trades, as it was. And so if the group comes in, they're going to have to import the labour force because the group there won't be there anymore. So it's I don't know, it's an imponderable situation. I worked in Melbourne in '69 when natural gas came in to replace coal gas for people's homes. And the government wanted a lot of emergency plumbers to convert the burners. They got them all right. They blew up more home cookers and hot water systems than you could point a stick at.
Big bet's going on.
And in a similar way, Mr. Rudd's roof insulation suffered the same fate of rushed training to try and do a job without being aware of the dangers and the do's and the don'ts that were required. So I don't know where the game's going. It's got to get back to politicians and the public servants who make the rules on behalf of the politicians to somehow demand, as you've made reference, that the training that the people get and the examinations to be awarded diplomas and advanced diplomas are pulled into some sort of real situation. So they're observations of the past. Thank you.
We'll take it as a valuable comment.
Right.
You haven't really mentioned, and that's a whole different area, apprentices and the problems with apprentices, and particularly as it relates to vocational training. A lot of them obviously used to get trained primarily through the TAFE system. So I just wondering if you could briefly talk about what's happening with apprentices and the breakdown of where their training, if any, is going. I know that a lot of companies are having trouble getting apprentices in the first place or holding on to them. Is training part of that problem, and do they have to pay some of the cost themselves? Is it being shifted onto the apprentices as well as regular students?
One of the consequences of, so in New South Wales Smart and Skilled, is that apprentices have actually been brought into the same overall funding model. So that means that apprentices in some cases are having to pay fees, especially if there's circumstances where they've had to repeat subjects or whatever. But they're also suffering because of the overall funding cuts to TAFE, which is resulting in things like reduction in course contact hours, closure of campuses, and students having to transfer campuses, travel long distances, and so on. So that's the concern. I think there was a fair degree of regrettable complacency in policy making that assumed that because the capital costs of apprenticeship training are so high that that TAFE would continue to just attract apprentice funding or apprentice numbers, and that everything would somehow be fine, and that the private market, the private competitors could just skim off all these other areas. But it completely overlooked that there are a couple of things. One, that there have been cuts to the TAFE operating budget to begin with. That cross-subsidisation has been an important part of how TAFE budgets have operated, and so it's really jeopardising it's jeopardising the training of quality, safe tradespeople in lots of areas.
The case of overseas students in these private training providers, we've heard about sometimes that they can be rorts in terms of they bring in overseas students to train them as hairdressers or chefs or whatever, and then suddenly overnight they can change to a different course, and these people don't seem to necessarily turn up to classes but are probably working illegally and to send money back home, etc. Just wondering, how much of a problem is that in reality in your experience, and those particular colleges, if that applies to, are under this umbrella you're talking about, are these getting government subsidies for doing stuff like that?
So the abuses that were linked to international students don't get any public subsidies to complete their courses. What those activities were about were immigration rules that allowed certain students and occupations in demand to provide a pathway to permanent residency or temporary residency or whatever. So that was the lure. So that was students, overseas students providing that money, and then being a cause for exploitation.
But would those organisations be getting government subsidy for internal students and then using that to help with their overseas operations?
No, I think some of them have just shifted operations, because now there are, before the liberalisation, before the access to the opening up of entitlement places and the liberalisation of vet fee help, it was very difficult for those kinds of colleges to get access to any kind of public dollars or student dollars. I think those kinds of colleges with that kind of business model are really going after diploma level courses, and why wouldn't you? You don't bother with providing certificate level courses, because then you have to go through the rigmarole of applying to the state training services, getting approved through a tender process, having to demonstrate that you have a process for engaging with student feedback and for enhanced staff development and so on, whatever. No, just go, so there was an example that was reported in the media of a Sydney college that was offering, rather than offering the usual, someone who wanted to do hairdressing, rather than offering the standard certificate 3 in hairdressing course, which is linked to the trade, bundling it up as a diploma of salon management / certificate 3 in hairdressing. All of a sudden you're eligible for vet fee help. You can charge the student $20,000, $30,000, whatever. They take out the vet fee help loan. You get the full amount up front, and hopefully the student disappears, and that's the last you have to worry about.
That company's just over with part.
Thank you. You have the next question, please.
Okay. This is a question that actually is to do more with outcomes, not necessarily what we're discussing tonight, but in terms of the government and society. Trades often take, in the past, trades could even take 7 to 15 years, depending on the trade you were in years ago. On average, they're 3 to 4 years. Now, if you start watering down a course or an industry and the training, the content, we're losing thousands of years of accumulated experience from TAFE teachers, for example. The private sector is often recycling information that comes from TAFE itself. From a national security point of view, or from a social point of view, even from a corruption and a taxation point of view, if the people that are coming out are having watered down courses, when it comes to on the job, their competence is actually quite diminished, or it's actually not there. What are the ramifications of actually doing this in the long run, where we may pass 1 or 2 political cycles, but as the kids start coming through and the old guys and girls start retiring, what would be some of the ramifications that will actually show the true colours? And on top of that, like you said earlier, I forgot your name, sorry, where once we lose TAFE, we can't go back. how do you actually bring that back when necessity will say you can't build your submarines, you can't build your industries, people are heavily undertrained? What would be some of the ramifications that we haven't thought of yet? They'll force us to actually say we've got to step back and actually in some ways go back, not go forward. Otherwise, it will actually be too late, actually be very dangerous for us. Could you please comment on that?
Thank you. Thanks.
Well, I mean, everything that you say is right. I mean, I think the issue is that, well, look, I mean, everything you say is right. I mean, the destruction of TAFE as a sector of education will have implications for the economy in terms of individual industries and the skills and so on. It will have implications for individuals and in particular, it will have incredible implications for young workers who will no longer now have access to a public vocational education system where they learn not just the trade and the skills of the actual industry area, but where they become citizens in society. It will have huge implications for people who are retrenched. It will have huge implications for people who are marginalised. It will have massive implications for students or for people in regional and rural areas. It has incredible implications for people who have disabilities. I mean, one of the key, I mean, all education sectors have a reach which is just massive, which goes well beyond, the obvious public reach. TAFE trains and educates people who work in just about every industry in the economy, in every community in Australia, in every town and every regional area. I mean, the reach of TAFE is phenomenal, and the impact of its demise will be significant, not just now, but into the future.
I think something to consider for the future is because a lot of our politicians generally tend to be career politicians or lawyers, for example, or from the humanities, they don't often have tangible, specific examples of how important the training is. For example, just imagine here tonight your lighting going out because your electrician doesn't have to do your wiring. Just imagine the guy preparing your meals actually has food poisoning because he has no training or knows what they're doing. Just imagine the aged care people that actually being killed because they don't realise that 0.1 is not the same as 1.0 or 10.0. The person who's, for example, plumbing, having sewage connected to your mains water rather than to the sewage system. If we don't realise, if we don't give specifics, we start to realise that it could be flicked at the tip of a pen, but without realising the ramifications of our actions. So there's something for future reference. Thank you.
Can we have the next question, please?
I was just wondering, given the failure of the courses or the qualifications in Victoria, has anyone given any consideration to having external examinations at the end of courses that all accredited training systems have to meet, so that there at least is some quality assurance?
Trade tests.
Look,
has there been any plans for that?
I think that in terms of trying to re-establish control and trust in the sector, there's the issue of testing, if you like, in all its forms after the event is certainly something that has been discussed. I can tell you now it won't happen. The costs involved in testing what is now close to 1.8 or 2 million students who go through the VET system annually, even though that's actually on the decline, would be so high that governments would have absolutely no appetite. The major issue in that is cost. The major issue, if you seriously wanted to try and look at a system of testing, and that really goes to the quote that I put up from Chris Robinson around there. They just don't know whether people have the skills that no person in this system at the moment can hold their hand on their heart and say that the kids who've been through the courses have the skills that they've paid for or that they've done the training for. Nobody knows that. That's the system we're in at the moment. And the costs of trying to verify that are just too excessive for the governments have no. Governments are trying to defund the system. They're trying to destroy the system. The costs involved in trying to do something like that would be just too great. Having said that, you're perfectly right. I mean, if you really wanted to start a system, if you really wanted to try to re-establish trust, you have to have some line in the sand where you can actually know. That's how low the trust level has got. And people will want to know. These are the questions that people will ask. Does my kid, do I have the skills that I've trained for, or that I've enrolled in, or increasingly, that I've paid many, many thousands of dollars for in my qualification?
Could I just ask someone a question? You were talking about the 30 cents in every dollar goes to the private providers. Overall, isn't the government spending a vast amount of money on doing this anyway? What are they saving anyway?
Well, they have loaned, in the first 5 months of this year, they have loaned $1.7 billion to young Australians to enrol in vet courses where there is no certainty around their outcomes. By the end of this year, it's close to three. It'll be close on that gauge. It'll be close to 3.5 billion.
So we're talking about a saving money project.
Well, yeah. So to go back to external examinations, it's an idea that pops up, because feedback from employers and from industry is, we're not happy with the quality of graduates. A report gets done, the idea gets floated. So Germany isn't alone in this, but Germany is the lead example here, which does have a kind of resilient apprenticeship system which extends beyond the traditional trades, as we know the apprenticeship model, into service industries like banking and hospitality and so on. They have external examinations that are run, that are overseen by local chambers of commerce. Employers are involved, unions are involved. That's why the system works, but it costs, and that's where. And you read the latest report that was done just I think a year or so ago. Here, it was commissioned by the Department of Industry. Industry stakeholders, employers said, "Oh yes, it's a great idea, but we wouldn't pay for it." But I think that what will happen, if you look at some of the more crucial trades where safety is a live issue, it's effectively what the electricians have tried to do in terms of maintaining, resisting the competency-based progression model, which started a lot of the rot that's put us in this situation. That's one trade that has maintained its scepticism of the utility of that model, maintained volume of learning requirements in terms of hours that apprentices have to go through, and also sort of final examinations as well. So absolutely, that would be one way. I think what will happen is that certain industries will start to do that, perhaps on a voluntary basis, like aged care, for example. I could imagine the aged care industry or an aged care association putting in place either a smaller number of approved providers that they sort of go to and assure have higher standards, or else instituting some kind of additional examination.
Please join me in thanking the two speakers for a wonderful talk and the wonderful answers they gave to all your questions.